King Sebastian I of Portugal was a young monarch with grand ambitions fueled by religious zeal. Ascending to the throne at just 3 years old in 1557, he grew up under the guidance of Jesuit tutors who instilled in him a fanatical sense of mission. As Sebastian came of age, he became convinced that he was destined to lead a crusade against the Muslim powers of North Africa and restore Christian rule there. This fervent belief in a sacred mission defined his reign. By his late teens, the king was impatient to prove himself on the battlefield and to expand Portugal's influence. He poured his energy into planning a military expedition to Morocco against the cautious advice of his older counselors. In 1578, King Sebastian launched his long-awaited campaign overseas, an adventure that would culminate in his mysterious disappearance and plunge Portugal into turmoil. Sebastian's crusading enterprise led to the Battle of the Three Kings on August 4th, 1578, a confrontation in northern Morocco that would decide his fate and that of the Portuguese Empire. The young king had allied with Mohammed II, a deposed Moroccan sultan who sought to reclaim his throne. In the summer of 1578, Sebastian landed in Morocco with a Portuguese-led invasion force of around 25,000 men, including Portuguese nobles, foreign mercenaries, and Moroccan allies. They marched inland under the blazing sun, determined to challenge the new Moroccan ruler, Sultan Abd al-Malik. On the plains near Qasr el-Kabir, the Portuguese coalition met a vastly superior Moroccan army. Portuguese planning and intelligence was extremely poor, and this battle was lost long before Sebastian and company made it to the battlefield. The Moroccan Sultan had received reinforcements from the powerful Ottoman Turks and was boasting a modern army with at least 60,000 men. When battle started, King Sebastian personally rode along his lines to rally his troops for the glory he envisioned. Despite initial confidence, the fight quickly turned against the Portuguese. Abd al-Malik, though gravely ill, led his forces from horseback, and the Moroccan army executed a bold plan to encircle the invaders. Early in the battle, a cannonball struck down one of Sebastian's key commanders, throwing the Portuguese center into confusion. Moroccan cavalry then surged around both flanks of Sebastian's army. After hours of fierce combat, the Portuguese lines crumbled under the pressure. The result was a catastrophic defeat. Thousands of Portuguese and their allies were slain, including nearly virtually all the entire high nobility of Portugal. It's estimated that the 15,000 survivors were taken captive and sold, mostly to work the galleys of the various Barbary pirates. Only a handful of Portuguese troops and their allies escaped the carnage. King Sebastian was last seen fighting valiantly amid his doomed troops, refusing to retreat even as the situation became hopeless. Amid the chaos and slaughter, the 24-year-old king vanished. His body was never conclusively identified on the field, leaving contemporaries uncertain whether he had perished or somehow survived the debacle. The Moroccan Sultan Abd al-Malik died during the battle, and Sebastian's ally drowned while fleeing. Notably, all three kings involved in the battle met their end that day. The battle's outcome was a disaster for Portugal, wiping out a generation of its leadership and ending Sebastian's ill-fated crusade in utter defeat. In the immediate aftermath of the battle, King Sebastian's fate became an enduring mystery. The most straightforward explanation is that he died in battle, as most of his men did. Indeed, given the overwhelming defeat and the fact that he was last seen surrounded by enemy forces, it's highly likely Sebastian was slain on the field. However, the failure to locate and positively identify his body gave rise to widespread speculation and hope that the young king might have somehow survived. In Portugal, a legend grew that Sebastian had escaped the battlefield, perhaps taken captive incognito or wandering in exile, and that he would one day return to his people. This messianic hope came to be known as Sebastianism. Sebastian's people, grief-stricken by the loss and facing an uncertain future, clung to the idea that their king would reappear in Portugal's darkest hour to save the nation. For years after 1578, rumors swirled of sightings and secret letters, all suggesting that Sebastian lived on in disguise. The belief in Sebastian's survival was so strong that it encouraged a series of false Sebastians to come forward in the decades after the battle. Between the 1580s and early 1600s, at least 4 different impostors declared themselves to be the missing monarch. These pretenders emerged in both Portugal and Spain, exploiting the popular longing for Sebastian's return. One particularly convincing false Sebastian was working as a baker in a Spanish town, when his colleagues noted that he could speak German and French, in addition to Spanish and Portuguese. Needless to say, it was a rarity for a simple baker to speak 4 languages at the time, and the stack of languages he spoke suggested he was from the high nobility. This baker, who was likely actually a Spanish man named Gabriel de Espinosa, was able to masquerade as Sebastian for a few months before the authorities ended his charade. Sebastian's disappearance had immediate and far-reaching consequences for Portugal. With the young king gone and no direct heir, the Portuguese monarchy faced a succession crisis. The king's elderly great-uncle, Cardinal Henry, assumed the throne. However, Henry was a celibate clergyman, and at nearly 70 years old, had no heirs of his own. He ruled for only 2 years, dying in 1580 and plunging Portugal further into a dynastic dispute. Backed by his powerful armies and a strong claim, Philip II of Spain invaded Portugal in 1580 to seize the throne. After defeating the remaining forces loyal to the Portuguese crown, Philip was proclaimed Philip I of Portugal in 1581, uniting the Spanish and Portuguese crowns. This began the period known as the Iberian Union, a dynastic union under the Spanish Habsburgs that lasted for 60 years. For Portugal, being absorbed into the Iberian Union marked the loss of the nation's independent sovereignty. Under Spanish rule, Portugal was governed by a foreign monarch, and although it retained formal autonomy in its laws and colonial administration, in practice the country became a junior partner. The consequences were significant. Portuguese colonies and trade were pulled into Spain's conflicts, and the once proud Portuguese navy and commerce suffered neglect. The disappearance of Sebastian thus inadvertently led to a decline in Portugal's standing and the end of its golden age of exploration and prosperity. In 1640, the Portuguese finally revolted and restored independence under the House of Braganza, ending the Iberian Union. However, the legacy of Sebastian's ill-fated crusade had already completely reshaped the course of Portuguese history. He had sought to win glory for his kingdom, but instead, his loss brought about a period of crisis and subjugation. Cambyses II was the second ruler of the Achaemenid Persian Empire and the eldest son of the famous conqueror Cyrus the Great. He ascended the throne around 530 BC and, much like his father, pursued aggressive military expansion. His most notable campaign was the conquest of Egypt in 525 BC, defeating Pharaoh Psamtik III at the Battle of Pelusium and bringing the ancient land of the Nile under Persian rule. As the new ruler of Egypt, Cambyses II also took on the title of Pharaoh. But his ambitions didn't stop at the Nile. While in Egypt, he planned further campaigns to Ethiopia and Carthage. However, neither of these plans materialized. However, most importantly for this story, he also sought to conquer the Siwa Oasis in the Western Desert. The Oracle of Amun at the Siwa Oasis was famous in the ancient world. Even Alexander the Great would later visit it. According to historical accounts, Cambyses II was angered or threatened by this oracle. In 524 BC, after capturing Egypt, he dispatched a detachment of about 50,000 Persian soldiers into the Western Desert, with orders to march on Siwa Oasis. This was essentially a punitive expedition against the priests of Amun, who were viewed as being unfavorable to Persian rule. Somewhere along the way, they vanished. Herodotus, the Greek historian, wrote that the force made it as far as the oasis of Karga, about halfway to Siwa, then met a terrible fate. In Cambyses' lifetime, no trace of the detachment was ever found. It simply never arrived at Siwa nor ever returned. This shocking disappearance of an entire army in the desert became a lingering worry for Cambyses II, who himself died a few years later under murky circumstances. Ancient writers like Herodotus provide the only detailed account of the lost army, and his dramatic story has captivated imaginations for well over 2 millennia. According to Herodotus's 5th century BC narrative, the Persian troops were swallowed by the desert, simply engulfed by a sudden sandstorm that buried all 50,000 men alive. Ever since, this tale has persisted as one of antiquity's greatest mysteries. How could an entire army simply vanish without a trace? The story has a tantalizing mix of elements: an ambitious king, a cursed mission against a sacred oracle, and the deadly forces of nature in the Sahara. The lost army remained a historical artifact that wasn't seriously investigated until the 19th century. Since then, its existence remains an archaeological holy grail, a puzzle that could confirm or refute an ancient historical account. Part of what keeps the mystery alive is the sheer scale of the event and the lack of concrete evidence. 50,000 men, if that number is accurate, would leave behind a lot of bones, weapons, and artifacts. Yet no definitive discovery has ever been confirmed. This absence of evidence has led many scholars to question the story. Some Egyptologists suspect the tale may be exaggerated or even fully apocryphal. Over the years, historians and scientists have proposed several explanations for what really happened to Cambyses' army, if it existed at all. The traditional explanation is the one given by Herodotus, a natural disaster. In this view, the army was simply overcome by the harsh desert environment. A sudden sandstorm, not uncommon in the Sahara, could indeed be deadly. Fierce desert winds can create a wall of sand type effect that could disorient anyone caught in the open. If such a storm lasted long enough, it might bury bodies and equipment in sand, erasing visible traces. Some scholars find this plausible, noting that the western desert's Great Sand Sea is known for massive dunes and extreme weather. However, others point out that it's unlikely for a sandstorm alone to eliminate every last man. If the story were true, some survivors would have presumably straggled out. It's also possible the soldiers succumbed to a combination of factors: extreme heat, thirst, and disorientation in the uncharted desert. Losing their way, they might have perished from dehydration and exposure, with the desert winds gradually covering their remains over time. Another popular theory, briefly touched upon earlier, is that the story was a myth or misreported history. Skeptics note that Herodotus wrote his account decades after the event and got his information secondhand, supposedly from Egyptian sources in Siwa. It's conceivable that no Persian army was actually lost in a sandstorm as described. Instead, the truth might have been less spectacular. For instance, the force could have been turned back by a sandstorm, and later generations turned it into a legend of divine punishment by the gods of the desert. Some historians argue that Herodotus, who loved a good tale to put it mildly, may have embellished the story in the extreme. After all, it seems highly unlikely that the Persians would have dispatched an extremely large force to conquer this oasis. First of all, it was a relatively small population center to begin with, and 50,000 men would have been an unreasonable allocation of resources. To put this in perspective, today the Siwa Oasis only has a population of 25,000 people. But perhaps most importantly, is the issue of supplying 50,000 troops on a march through the eastern Sahara Desert. This would be an extremely difficult task in modern times, with modern logistics, let alone in ancient times. If this lost army was based on a real event, it seems like the number may have been exaggerated by as much as 1 or even 2 orders of magnitude. The lack of corroborating records in Persian or Egyptian about this mass death is extremely suspicious as well. If Cambyses truly lost such a large part of his army, one might expect Persian chronicles or Egyptian inscriptions to mention it, yet we have none. Notably, some modern historians suspect that the lost army may have been a myth conjured up by the Persians themselves to cover up for a loss in battle. There's some evidence that Egyptian loyalists under Petubastis III scored a significant victory against the Persians around the time when the Lost Army event supposedly occurred. In favor of this, Petubastis III seized the moment to retake parts of Egypt, even crowning himself pharaoh in Memphis, before the Persians could respond. 2 years later, Cambyses' successor Darius I reconquered the area and crushed the rebellion. Adventurers and archaeologists have mounted expeditions into the Egyptian desert specifically to find traces of the Persian force. In the 1930s, numerous European expeditions attempted to find any hint of the army, but turned up empty-handed. In the 1980s, more systematic searches were conducted using aircraft and basic ground-penetrating radar. Notably, some suspicious bone fragments were discovered, but they were later dated to 1500 BC, ruling them out. In recent years, modern satellite imagery and remote sensing have been applied in hopes of spotting unusual shapes under the sand, but nothing conclusive has surfaced as yet. Despite all efforts, no unequivocal physical evidence of Cambyses' 50,000 soldiers has ever been verified, and whether the story itself is true or not remains a mystery. Hey everyone, it's Jimmy here, just reminding you to share this video with your friends and on your socials. Now let's get back to business. Rongo Rongo is an undeciphered system of glyphs from Easter Island, also called Rapa Nui. Discovered by outsiders in the 19th century, these symbols were carved on wooden objects and appear to represent a form of writing. European missionaries first reported the script in the 1860s. In 1864, a priest noticed wooden tablets covered with hieroglyphs, or some writing system in the houses of Easter Islanders. Notably, at this time, he reported that some of the locals were aware of the meaning of the script. A few years later, in 1868, a priest in Tahiti received a couple of these inscribed tablets from Rapa Nui converts, sparking new interest. By then, however, the island's population had been devastated by raids and disease, and reportedly no one was left who could still read the glyphs. Many tablets were lost or destroyed during this turbulent period. In the aftermath, about 24 wooden objects with Rongo Rongo inscriptions were eventually collected and sent to museums. According to later Rapa Nui oral tradition, only a select elite of priests and wise men could read this script, and that knowledge died with them along with the raids and disease. Rongo Rongo's significance is potentially highly profound. If it truly encodes language, it represents a unique instance of a writing system invented in complete and total isolation. Scholars have observed that Rongo Rongo shares no obvious similarities with any other form of writing. It may have been devised entirely by the Rapa Nui people, representing an independent invention of writing that would make it one of the very few in human history. A recent study even found that one wooden tablet dates to the 15th century, evidence that the script predates European or any known outside influence on the island. Yet Rongo Rongo's isolation also makes it hard to decipher. There are no bilingual inscriptions or translations to use as a key, and the body of texts is extremely limited, about 15,000 glyphs in total. The underlying language of the texts is assumed to be an old form of Rapa Nui, but by the late 19th century, the spoken Rapa Nui language had changed under outside influences. Some researchers have even wondered if Rongo Rongo is actually a full writing system, or more of a device used to memorize chants. Under this theory, the glyphs are less hieroglyphic in nature, and more mnemonic devices that were used by elders for the purposes of ceremonies. Despite the difficulties, many people have tried to crack the Rongo Rongo code. Early attempts involved working with the last native individuals who might have known it. In the 1860s, a local bishop attempted to have an islander named Matoro chant several tablets aloud. Matoro's recitations were inconsistent, and many readings weren't reproducible. The bishop suspected that Matoro either misunderstood how to read the script or was intentionally holding back. Many have speculated that Matoro may not have wanted to provide proper chants and translations to a Christian authority figure for fear of seizure or even destruction of the materials. After all, missionaries were in the process of actively and aggressively converting the island, and memories of the old ways may not have been congruent with this. In 1886, an islander named Urivai Iko provided another tantalizing clue. He had been a servant to the last Rapa Nui king, who he said knew Rongo Rongo. Notably, Uri didn't claim to be literate in the language himself, but claimed that he was able to recall the content of some of the inscriptions from memory. He was asked to chant from one of the tablets in the Rapa Nui language. What he recited turned out to be a traditional Rapa Nui creation chant, discussing the order of the creation of the world. Notably, this also gives credence to the theory that Matoro may have intentionally obfuscated the content of the Rongo Rongo items when he was talking to the bishop in the 1860s. However, Uri was recalling an oral text from memory, and researchers could not confidently match his words to specific glyphs on the tablets. These early Rapa Nui informants hinted that the Rongo Rongo texts might be ceremonial or mythological in nature, but they didn't reveal the actual mechanism of the writing. Legitimate academic interest in Rongo Rongo didn't pick up until the mid-20th century. Modern scholarly efforts began in the mid-20th century. In 1958, a German scholar, Thomas Barthel, identified a sequence of about 30 glyphs on one tablet as a lunar calendar. According to him, the glyphs in that sequence appear to correspond to lunar cycles. This was a breakthrough in understanding at least the subject of that text. Even so, while scholars agree this sequence is a calendar, they still can't actually read it in terms of language. Rather, they simply know what it represents. Numerous other scholars and amateur code crackers have taken a shot at Rongo Rongo, but at present only Thomas Barthel's findings have been universally accepted. If Rongo Rongo is truly a system for writing Rapa Nui, it represents one of the few times in human history writing has ever been independently invented, and the only time in complete isolation. Also, just as a quick aside, I just realized I spent this entire time talking about Easter Island, without mentioning Moai statues. Now, not to toot my own horn here, but I feel like that might be some sort of record.